Thank you very much. Here is the outline of my talk. First, I will give some introductory remarks. Then, I will discuss Knight and Johnson's argument for the priority of democracy, and actually they presented that argument in their book, The Priority of Democracy, Political Consequences of Pragmatism, that was published in 2011. Then I'll offer some criticism of their argument, and finally I will give a sketch of my own view on this topic. So, obviously, there are many different ways to talk about the priority of democracy. Traditionally, for example, Plato or Aristotle argued that there are priority of some forms of government over some other forms. For example, they argued that there is a priority of democracy over tyranny, and Aristotle was thinking that there is also priority of democracy over oligarchy, but that there is priority of kingship or aristocracy over democracy, and so on. So that's a very traditional way to talk about the priority of democracy, and it continued in modern times. So it's interesting maybe to say that, for example, Hobbes, who is not seen as a lover of democracy, in his earlier writings argued actually that there is a priority, at least temporal priority, of democracy over some other forms of government, because he was thinking that in order to have any form of sovereignty, we need to have popular sovereignty first. So at the very moment when we make agreement and agree with each other to form a society, we at the same time agree that we make every other decision by the majority rule. So this means that we establish popular sovereignty, and in order to have monarchy or aristocracy, these people who decide by majority rule transfer their sovereignty to this one or group of persons who will have sovereignty after that. So these are interesting questions that that were discussed even in 11th century, but this is not the perspective that I want to talk about. In the 20th century, this topic of priority of democracy was mostly discussed in the framework of that democracy should have some priority over different kinds of despotic or totalitarian regimes. So this argument was actually part for a normative justification of democracy. But I will leave that kind of talk about the priority of democracy also aside. What I want to focus in this presentation is on a very recent argument for a second-order priority of democracy as presented by Knight and Johnson in this book from 2011. Because the conception of deliberative democracy will be important for my argument, I will presuppose that you're familiar with the ideal of deliberative democracy, but I want at the outset just to make a few distinctions that I'll need for my further arguments. First, I want to make a distinction when I'm talking about deliberative democracy between formal and informal deliberation. Actually, we have formal deliberation when some conditions are satisfied, especially conditions of freedom, equality, some kind of reciprocity. Some people add a condition of consensus, but I will offer critique of the conditions and so on. And we have informal deliberation when those conditions don't need to be satisfied. We don't even need a specified procedure of discussion. And this is what usually happens in civil society. But some people think that it is not genuine deliberation. John Rawls, for example, was thinking that this use of public reason doesn't apply to what he calls background culture, this civil society environment, but only to this very specified, but only in these conditions where these conditions are satisfied. And I will also make a distinction between what I would call purely participatory deliberative democracy, and this is a view presented by Joshua Cohen, and the main idea is that we can about the ideal of deliberative democracy is that it is an ongoing community which regulates its own affairs by means of free and reasoned deliberation of equal citizens. So in this ideal we don't need institutions such as voting and that kind of thing, so we could just regulate all social affairs by means of deliberation. And there is also the other view on deliberative democracy that might be called deliberation cum voting view, or John Dries called this second view liberal constitutionalist deliberative democracy, which presuppose that we have some forms and procedures of deliberation, but that we also have constitutions, elections, and a host of other institutional mechanisms. And I would like to say that I subscribe to this second view of deliberative democracy, and when I will talk about the priority of deliberative democracy, I think that arguments offered by Knight and Johnson and some other arguments actually support this second view of deliberative democracy. So now let me present the argument Knight and Johnson. Here are some basic assumptions. First, they think that we should start from the fact of diversity. And for them, there are many dimensions of diversity. For example, there's multiplicity of interests, of worldviews, of preferences, values, and whatnot. Because it's not a kind of reasonable multiplicity or plurality as seen by Rawls, but we have many dimensions of this diversity. And they say that it is a social fact and that this diversity is irreducible, so it is not possible to reduce this multiplicity of interests, perspectives, and so on. If that is the case, then it is obvious that this kind of multiplicity will usually lead to a lot of conflicts and disagreements. So they say that this is what characterizes the conditions of politics, this kind of disagreements and conflicts. But at the same time, they also think that we need some kind of coordination in order to cooperate, in order not to fight all the time, but to somehow regulate our interactions. So, and their answer, that's the second assumption, that actually institutions are best means for regulating this kind of conflicts and disagreements, and they define institutions as a set of rules that emerge from and subsequently structure social and political interaction. But this is a very common view, but here we have a problem, because there is also multiplicity of ways to structure certain interactions. So it might be there might be indeterminacy over which institutional mechanism will be best for arranging certain interactions. And they think that actually they solve this problem by presupposing that institutions are arbitrary outcomes of strategic interaction. But if that is the case, then institutions could reflect whatever asymmetries we find before forming institutional arrangements. So that it means that there is a strong burden of justification of institutions because different kinds of asymmetries could be simply reflected. For example, bargaining power of the parties could be reflected directly in the institutional arrangements. And I think that democracy could help here to explain what is the best way to coordinate institutional arrangements. And also, they subscribe to what they call institutional pluralism, which means that we don't only have a plurality of interests, we have also plurality of institutional mechanisms, and it could be that some of them are more appropriate for certain domains than each other, so we have a problem to select which institutional mechanisms are most appropriate. And they reject what they call first-order priority of democracy. That would mean that democracy actually offers, it is that mechanism that could coordinate each and every domain in the best way. So they think that that is not the case, so that we should offer some other argument, and that is what they call second-order priority of democracy. And there are also some methodological assumptions. First, they think that the best approach for this problem is rational choice perspective, and it might be obvious from their explanation of the evolution of institutions that in which way rational choice perspective might be useful, but at the same time it is very hard to argue for the justification of democracy from the perspective of rational choice theory, because as we are well aware, main arguments against the normative justification, which show that it is not possible normatively to justify democracy, comes from rational choice theory. I will mention here Arrow's impossibility theorem, Down's view on the rational voter paradox, and many other and similar paradoxes. But I also think that despite all that, rational choice perspective could offer arguments for normative justification of democracy. And finally, they describe their position as pragmatist, and by that they mean three things. First, that the main characteristic of their view is experimentalism. As we will see, they think that the main way to collect the knowledge or functioning of certain institutions is just to experiment, to try with various institutional mechanisms and then see what happens. And that, so they think that one main presuppositions for their second-order priority, for their argument of second-order priority of democracy is this experimentation. Then the second thing is anti-skepticism, and finally consequentialism. Like I said, experimentation is the most important thing for establishing second-order priority, but there is also important feature of consequentialism, because they think they call their position constrained consequentialism, which means that we should monitor not just effectiveness of institutional mechanisms, but also conditions in which those effects are produced. In that sense, because they think that democracy could could monitor both effects and conditions, we could say that they offer a position which, when we talk about contemporary normative justification of democracy, we usually talk about procedure and substance, about procedures and outcomes, and so on. So their position could be described as dualist, because they think that both conditions that constrain procedures, but also the effects of those procedures, are important for justification of democracy. So they think that democracy should have a second-order priority because it is able to monitor its own conditions and effects, and for that reason it is also able to monitor across the whole range of institutional arrangements. Here is how they present their case for the second-order priority of democracy. Democracy is a set of institutions. It has an important priority over the available institutional alternatives. This priority is not of a first-order variety. Democracy is not the best way for us to coordinate all of our ongoing social, economic, and political interactions. We are often better served by relying on other institutional forms for that purpose. Rather, the priority we accord to democracy reflects its usefulness in approaching the crucial second-order task involved in the ongoing process of selecting, implementing, and maintaining effective institutional arrangements. These second-order tasks of achieving effective institutional performance involve monitoring and assessing the performance of the various social institutions, including democratic decision-making itself. That any particular society relies upon to coordinate its ongoing interactions. As it turns out, these tasks involve establishing and maintaining an experimental environment that can enhance our knowledge of the relationships between different institutional forms and the conditions under which they produce good consequences. We argue that democracy is especially, almost uniquely conducive to these undertakings. So, they base their argument for second-order priority of democracy on two mechanisms. They think that these two mechanisms are voting and deliberation, or political argument. When talking about voting, they start, and because they accepted this rational choice perspective, they start from the social choice theory. And as it is well known, Kenneth Arrow showed that at least this result, this impossibility theorem, was interpreted later, for example, by Riker, that it undermines any normative justification of democracy. He just demonstrated in a formal mathematical way that several conditions cannot be simultaneously satisfied, that is, conditions of universal domain, independence of irrelevant alternatives, non-dictatorship, and a weak Pareto condition, and collective rationality. So any majority voting procedure, when we also want to have Condorcet winner by pairwise comparisons, will generate either dictatorial decision, so this condition of non-dictatorship will not be satisfied, or condition of collective rationality will not be satisfied. So in that sense, we say that, especially in a case when this condition of collective intentionality is not satisfied, that actually voting, that is the conclusion, that voting is meaningless because there's a cycling of preferences, so we cannot define what the social choice is. So that is the main problem with normal justification of voting. Then, when talking about deliberation, Knight and Johnson make a slight difference to normal way of presenting what deliberation is. They rather talk about the political argument. And by political argument, they mean the exchange of reasons in conditions of conflict and disagreement. What is for them genuine deliberation is when this exchange of reasons is given in conditions of freedom and equality. And as this political argument approximate these conditions, we talk about genuine deliberation. So, on their view, we have two basic mechanisms. These are voting and deliberation, or political argument, but I don't see much difference here. We have two basic conditions that are freedom to influence the outcome of the decision making and equal influence over the outcome of the decision making procedure. And finally, they expect from these mechanisms and conditions that we will have three kinds of effects. First, we can structure disagreement. Second, we can improve the epistemic quality of decisions. And finally, what is the most important for them and most important for their argument for second-order priority of democracy is that we can reflexively monitor, or the democracy could reflexively monitor its own conditions and effectiveness. So, actually, the argument for second-order priority of democracy is based on these mechanisms of voting and deliberation and on its ability to reflexively monitor for democracy's ability to reflexively monitor its own conditions and effectiveness. Their main argument why should democracy have this second-order priority is for coordinating across a whole range of institutional arrangements is that basically that the other formal or non-formal institutional mechanisms are not able to monitor its own conditions. So they just do some kind of comparative analysis by showing that different kinds of formal and non-formal mechanisms like markets, bureaucracies, courts, and so on simply cannot monitor its own conditions. So this is how they present this argument. The key here is that market interaction and legal decision-making are decentralized in a sense that those party to any particular interaction are charged neither with reviewing or monitoring in an ongoing way the conditions under which institutions of exchange and legal disputation themselves operate, nor with assessing the consequences of how broader institutional arrangements operate. This hopefully is clear from our discussion of markets. We argue in the next chapter that it is true as well of judicial decision-making. It is just here that the democratic institutions enable a level of reflexivity unavailable in other institutional mechanisms. For political argument, not only allows members of a democratic polity to collectively revisit past substantial decisions, it also allows them to collectively reconsider and revise the terms of their ongoing interactions. Democratic politics, in other words, structures this agreement not just over policy decisions, but also over the operation and reform of social and political institutions. Moreover, because democratic arrangements structure political arguments so as to allow the emergence of new ideas, perspectives, and interests, and thereby new constituencies and oppositions, this reflexivity has an endogenous dynamic dimension. So, actually, what they are arguing is that this reflexive character of democratic procedures is basis for second-order priority democracy, because it is able, as they see, to monitor its own conditions and effects, and the other institutional mechanisms simply cannot do that. So democracy should have priority in that sense. And I will, of course, offer some criticism of this view. But before that, I want to say that although I disagree with their argument for second-order priority of democracy, I agree with the other two effects. But what they say about the other two effects of democratic procedures: first, that they could structure disagreement, and second, that they could improve the epistemic quality of decisions. Actually, they for this first effect, they offer arguments that's based on the idea of single peak preferences, and it's familiar already from a discussion of David Miller from 1992, and they also offered their own view and their own solution for the social choice problem in their paper from 1994, and then we had a discussion in List and Rizek in 2003, and some other discussions which show that if we reject or relax the condition of universal domain and accept the condition of single peakedness, or that there is some kind of restriction of the orderings of preferences, in a sense that they will single peak, which means that if we have most preferred option, that in the graphic presentation of the preferences, that options which are less preferred will go further on the left and right hand side of the graph. And if we have that kind of preferences over a single dimension, then we could have also satisfied condition of collective rationality and all other conditions. And this strongly suggests that we should favor the conception of democracy, which includes both voting and deliberation, over conception of democracy that relies only on voting. I will not talk too much about the second effect, but I also think that it could be accepted that this kind of procedure that includes both voting and deliberation could improve the epistemic quality of decisions, and the whole session of our conference will be devoted to this epistemic aspect of democracy, so I will not talk too much about that. I would notice here just that it is strange that Knight and Johnson don't discuss at all Estlund's view on they rely on Scott Page's view about usefulness of diversity of knowledge, of input of different views and perspectives for increasing the quality of decisions, but they don't even mention Estlund's view, which according to my own view is crucially important for arguing that this kind of democratic procedure, which includes both voting and deliberation, could increase epistemic quality of decisions. And for example, Aslund says that if some conditions that are not really hard to satisfy are satisfied, for example, that we have enough time for discussion, that we could accept the reasons of other people, we could speak freely and so on, that it will certainly that deliberation could contribute to better quality of democratic decisions. So, actually, like I said, I agree that this kind of procedure, consisting of mechanism of voting and deliberation, could deliver this kind of effects, structuring disagreement and increasing epistemic quality. But where I think that the main problem with Knight and Johnson's argument is with this use of the reflexive character of democratic procedures for arguing in favor of the second-order priority of democracy. So, what I think is that from reflexivity of democratic decision-making, it simply doesn't follow that democratic decision-making is appropriate for monitoring across a whole range of institutional arrangements. Actually, it is possible that democracy could monitor its own conditions and effects, but then we need some other argument which will show that democracy is also able to monitor conditions and effects in other domains. And I think that Knight and Johnson didn't offer that kind of argument. There's also a problem with epistemic dimension. Actually, they, like I said, ascribe to institutional pluralism. But I think that we should also then accept that there will be some domain-specific institutional knowledge. And I think that Knight and Johnson would accept that in a form of rejecting first-order priority of democracy. But then their argument for the epistemic quality of democratic decision-making is not sufficient for establishing that this knowledge will be relevant or sufficient for monitoring conditions and effects in each and every domain. Actually, they didn't establish the relation between the epistemic quality of democratic decision-making and relevant knowledge for each and every domain. Maybe, for example, experts in certain domains could outperform democracy in doing this job of monitoring conditions and effectiveness and so on. Then I think that we have some, let's say limited, but we have some evidence that these first two effects will follow if we have this kind of procedures. And I think here on the evidence from deliberative polls, which show both that deliberation could structure disagreement. This is joint work done by List, Fishkin, and other collaborators. I think that there is also a lot of evidence from deliberative polls which show that deliberation increased the level of knowledge. That is almost every experiment with deliberative polls showed this increase in knowledge, but there is certainly lack of experimental evidence for this kind of reflexivity of democratic decision-making procedures that Knight and Johnson rely on in their argument for second-order priority of democracy. And there is one further problem with their view, because I think that there are actually, and here I see a really huge problem. There are no limits on experimentation. For example, when they're criticizing courts as a mechanisms of coordinating a whole range of institutional activities, they say they cannot revise their own conditions, they cannot put in question their conditions because they're constrained by constitutions. But then, as I understand this perspective of deliberation and deliberative democracy, I think that it is more appropriate for conditions that Rawls, for example, called constitutional democratic society. So it is not completely unconstrained. So, for example, Knight Johnson says, but in keeping with our commitment to plurality of institutional forms, it is important to highlight one hopefully obvious implication of our discussion to this point. The reflexivity of democratic decision-making will often allow constituencies to decide to coordinate their ongoing social interactions across expansive domains through various non-democratic institutional forms, which means that they think that actually there is no limit on democratic majorities to decide across a whole range of institutional arrangements, which I see really problematic, because these first two effects, in my view, support this second view of deliberative democracy, which would respect conditions of equality and some kind of constitutional guarantees. But then we see that this condition of reflexivity goes through unconstrained through a whole range of institutional arrangements, and I see a problem here. So I think that Knight and Johnson didn't establish a second order priority of democracy, but I also think that their argument shows that deliberative democracy, and in this form it includes both voting and deliberation, should have priority over other decision-making mechanisms, either purely deliberative or that are based simply on voting. I also think that the value of their discussion is that we should put at the center stage formal deliberation and this deliberation convoting perspective, because they could have important effects of structuring disagreement and increasing epistemic quality of this democratic decision making. And I think the main because I agree with them on that point. Where I disagree is on their rejection of this condition of taking people. They accept condition of freedom, of equality, but they reject this condition of taking persons as reasonable and rational, which includes also what Rawls calls the requirement of reciprocity, that we offer reasons that other, which means that we offer reasons that other could accept, that we accept also force of the better argument, and so on. And I think that they reject, and they're constantly arguing against that condition from their paper from 1996, because they disagree. They think that we should focus on conflicts, on disagreements, and not to constrain disagreement in this formal way by stating such kind of condition. But what I'm thinking is that that kind of condition that will take persons as reasonable could do a lot of work for producing, and actually I think is doing a lot of work for producing these first two effects of structuring disagreement and increasing epistemic quality of decisions. So, if this is so, then there is a question: should then deliberative democracy in this form, includes voting and deliberation, have a first order priority, then should govern across a whole range of institutions? And that is the idea offered, for example, initially by coin, because he was thinking that we can use deliberative democracy because it is a more realistic way to realize justice in a society, more realistic way than, for example, Rawls' idea of original positions. So, because that is some kind of social contract position, this kind of deliberation could somehow approximate these conditions of original position, but in the same way be more realistic way for governing each and every institutions. I think I don't have time to express my disagreement with this view also, but what I would like to say is that I don't think that this kind of conception of democracy should have, or democracy should have a second-order priority in a way that Knight and Johnson think that it should have, and I also think that it should not have a first-order priority in a sense of this contractualism democracy analogy, like Aslan calls it. But I simply think, or my view is more modest, that these arguments show that actually this perspective on deliberative democracy should help us to design just democratic decision-making procedures that at the same time will be normatively justified. Thank you.